Another mode of vitalism, running from Royer to Leibniz, entails also another mode of aesthetics, one that does not rely on the work of art as a condition in general, that would bring the subject back to its acts of perception that constitute its world. As Deleuze suggests in The Fold, this form of vitalism does not see life as a constituting power that flows forth and recognizes itself after the event of creation. It is a vitalism of divergent series in which every power to perceive creates its own opening to the infinite, its own series of perceptions passing from finitude to an open whole. For Leibniz, there are not selves who perceive, nor subjective powers that synthesize the given, for the harmony of the universe follows from the fact that there is only one universe, perceived differently by every one of its components. The universe is not some single object that is then perceived or synthesized. There are events of perception, each of which is an unfolding of an infinite series. There is no conflict in these series, precisely because there is no outside as such, or life as such, beyond all the points of view. This doesn't mean that truth is relativized, that we don't get to the truth because of perspectives. Rather, truth is composed of relative series, not located in a point, but an open whole of converging and diverging points. Life is just this quantity of divergent worlds. As a more modern form of this line of thinking, Royer's vitalism simultaneously entails a resistance to mechanism, to the idea that one might determine in advance the various lines of becoming that compose the universe, and a radical passivity, as in his concept of absolute survey. As Royer argues in Neo-Finalisme, every perception is a feeling of the whole of being, a sense or orientation that is productive of a located viewpoint, a viewpoint that can be located only because it bears its own sense of a whole or relation of which it is also an effect. Thus, the concept of becoming, far from being a radically new turn in a 21st century, 2000s, vitalism that has broken with normalizing metaphysics, it is the normalizing concept par excellence. It has always been the case that anything resistant to dynamism, fruition, creation, and a flowing forth of open and productive life has been demonized as a death or inertia that tarnishes life from the outside. A subject must be nothing other than the event of its own performance, acting, or unfolding. If, following Butler, we recognize that performance is enabled by prior norms, for one must always perform as this or that specified being, we nevertheless take heart in the power to perform that will introduce a certain non-being or indecidability into the rigidity of the very identity upon which we must unfortunately rely. Butler's success as a theorist lies in her capacity to maintain a tradition of theory as theoria, as a looking or perceiving that activates itself in a resistance to that which would be merely given and immune to the becoming one takes upon oneself as an ethical subject. Against this Butlerian retrieval of a relation between norm and performance, one might suggest that, rather than rely on something like becoming in general, a power of creativity or dynamism that is different and distant from any norm, one could always see becoming as having a relation to what is not itself. Becoming animal, for Deleuze and Guattari, is not the becoming of the animal, just as becoming woman does not proceed from women as a group, even a group formed for the purposes of action alone in some decision of strategic essentialism. Indeed, becoming occurs not as a retrieval of the life, dynamism, or vitality that has fallen into reification and substantivism, but an encounter between a life, always this power of difference, with another. Deleuze and Guattari insist that pluralism is monism, because if there are 1,000 tiny becomings or awarenesses, there is no transcendental ground or subject, no life in general. If there is a plurality, their celebrated monism is of a power of difference and not a single life that differs. Vitalist aesthetics. In order to make this more explicit, I want to contrast two modes of vitalism and aesthetics, the first from Ezra Pound and the second from D.H. Lawrence. An aesthetics tied to active vitalism privileges impersonality as distance from personae, defamiliarization, and negation. Usually, such an aesthetics presents itself as a strictly formalist endeavor. It matters less what one says in a work of art than the disjunction one manages to achieve between represented content and the forming power that synthesizes materials. In general, then, the modernist techniques of fragmentation, disembodied voices, illusion, and parataxis preclude a subject being presented and instead intimate a power of presentation that is never given as such. Consider Ezra Pound's modernism, which began with the presentation of personae as personae, but which developed into the epic venture of the Cantos, a work that quoted Western culture from Sappho to the present as so much dead, circulating, passively repeated and atomized content devoid of animation. Thus, Hugh Selwyn Mauberley presents a voice that answers both to the markets of consumption, the age demanded an image, and to the desire for a synthesis of the past in the present, the classics in paraphrase. Pound began with translations of the Chinese poetry of Li Po and fragments of the Western poetic tradition before the latter fell into what Pound saw as a weak and flabby dependence on the propulsions of rhyme and meter. Often, what he borrowed, though in another voice, was quoted in such a way as to create a disjunction with the present, so that the voice of the past is reanimated to speak as if from the point of view Pound himself would have sought. So the opening of The Seafarer, which Pound translated from early Anglo-Saxon, presents the distanced singing voice detached from its own culture. May I for my own self song's truth reckon, journey's jargon, how I in harsh days hardship endured oft. Despite its seeming passivity, Pound's use of the past, here the evocation of Anglo-Saxon sources, and elsewhere his use of Sappho, the Greek epic, Dante, and even, as in Hugh Selwyn Mauberley, earlier phases of his own work, enables a mode of active vitalism typical of high modernism. By taking up already given fragments and voices of the past, the implied modernist artist is, to quote Joyce after Flaubert, like the god of the creation, remaining within or behind or beyond or above his handiwork, invisible, refined out of existence, indifferent, paring his fingernails. It is because the artist remains indifferent that he is never determined by any specific or finite position within the world, but remains pure creation liberated from any of the points of view that he adopts. Pound's use of fragments, personae, translations, voices, and historical periods, for all its implied absence of authorial intervention, enables a position of pure act or creative force, untainted by the substance or finitude of an action or creation. The mode of quotation is crucial. The author is at once not speaking, not present, and yet able to summon materials that speak about a world in which speaking is no longer possible, or at least distanced and difficult. The present has been rendered so passive as to preclude the possibility of speaking authentically. One can only repeat the fragments of the past, yet never be at one with that lost past. In Pound's translation of Li Po, the poetic voice is not that of romantic interiority or self-expression, but perception reduced to its relation to the world, a simple I that is nothing other than its present. While my hair was still cut straight across my forehead, I played about the front gate, pulling flowers. In his imagist phase, Pound also tries to present language as an object, standing alone, presenting an image as such. This making new of language is directed toward reviving the force and energy of language and also, and Pound was explicit about this, reviving the imagination that would no longer be enslaved by conventions and easy listening, nor by bourgeois taste. Pound's poetics was one of anti-commodification. This governing intention later led him to criticize his own imagism for producing yet one more fashionable and easily digested vogue. The age demanded an image of its accelerated grimace, something for the modern stage, not at any rate an Attic grace. Yet it was his final project, the Cantos, that yielded an aesthetics that was vitalist, sexually normative, and fascist. Vitalist. Through processes of fragmentation, cutting, juxtaposition, parataxis, and the insertion of untranslated elements, culture could be presented as lacking any already given synthesis, forcing the reader, and culture in general, to confront the machinic, atomized, lackluster, and incoherent nature of modern life. Sexually normative. Not only did Pound present figures of a fallen sexuality that were variously diagnosed as homosexual, promiscuous, effeminate, and therefore infertile, he also created a direct association between sexuality and artistic production. Modernity suffers from a compulsion toward a restricted economy. In its corrupted and fallen mode, life, like art, must be measured through capital. What is lost is expenditure that has not determined its productive end in advance. At a formal level, this meant that Pound aligned artistic experimentation with a fertile, productive, and living expenditure that would produce ends that were not already determined. At the level of content, Pound placed journalists, homosexuals, Jews, and bankers in an excremental hell. Journalists merely allowed language to circulate for profit rather than genuine poetic creation. Homosexuals were guilty of a same sexuality that could know no genuine creation or life. Bankers, and by extension for Pound, Jews, were responsible for the institutions of usury, which would direct all money into the creation of further money, precluding any excessive expenditure that might allow for genuine production. The stench of wet coal, politicians, and their wrists bound to their ankles, standing bare bum, faces smeared on their rumps, wide eye on flat buttock, bush hanging from beard, addressed crowds through their arseholes, addressing the multitudes in the ooze, newts, water slugs, water maggots, and with them, a scrupulously clean table napkin tucked under his penis, and, who disliked colloquial language, stiff-starched but soiled, collars circumscribing his legs, the pimply and hairy skin pushing over the collar's edge, profiteers drinking blood sweetened with shit, and behind them, and the financiers lashing them with steel wires, and the betrayers of language, and the press gang, and those who had lied for hired, the perverts, the perverters of language, the perverts who have set money lust before the pleasures of the senses. Pound associated proper, fruitful, excessive, and creative spending with a pre-modern form of patronage, where art was not yet subjected to markets, commodified language, effete styles of pleasure, or the homogenizing blandness of democracy. Finally, Pound's effort turns fascist. By emphasizing art as a decisive break with the circulation and system of production, for the sake of a higher, productive, and creative end, beyond already actualized life, Pound justified a violence of the present for the sake of a future that would return life to its proper, active, and expansive creative potential. Indeed, it is just in this respect that one might consider fascism to be tied to a certain privilege of becoming. Radically futural, fascism acts for the sake of a radical decision and act over the meandering and undirected or unfruitful pleasures and affects of the present. Fascism, at least in its modernist form, was tied to a horror of static, inert, reifying, and lifeless infertility of 20th century, 1900s, democracy, or more specifically, a diffuse, inhuman, because animal-like, dispersion of a people who would be devoid of decision, self-identity, striving, and vigorous assertion. Pound's work is complex, and its tendencies to fascism, its privileging of the single decision and productive force of the future, cannot be unequivocally separated from a revolutionary impulse that would not be enslaved to an axiomatic of production and directed force. One needs to consider the ways in which an active vitalism of self-constituting life that produces itself from itself is distinguished ever so subtly from a passive vitalism that enables life to be thought of from divergent, dispersed, and infinitely divisible points of difference. That is, whereas Pound's response to the horrors of modern democracy, its tendency to render all forces equivalent, to reduce intensity and distinction to vague uniformity and single quantities, was to assert the life and force of art as decision, another passive vitalist potential, opened thought to vibrations of life and thinking beyond act and decision. When Deleuze and Guattari considered the tendency of the body without organs to develop a cancerous or fascist mode, they confront two of the major problems of modernist aesthetics and its relation to politics. First, the vital productive forces of life cannot be deemed to be good in opposition, to the evils of undecided, animalistic, mechanic, and squandering forces of death. For this moral opposition between productive, bounded, formed, and self-asserting life, and a diffuse and squandering dispersal of forces, is a moralism of the organism, where bounded living forms are opposed to the dissolution of death. Second, fascism is an internal possibility of the vital order, not an accident that befalls an otherwise good life from without. Pound's work is worthy of attention, precisely because it gathers revolutionary forces that would break with bourgeois humanism and normalizing stasis, and yet reterritorializes those same forces on a normative image of life as pure becoming, that encounters no event other than itself and its own production. If, as Pound did, one fragments the syntax that normally allows the reader to pass from one term to another, if one places usually opposed and contrasted terms alongside one another without connectives, then the reader is forced to compose an order that is not given, or at least confront a disorder that would foreground the arbitrariness of any system. Reading is not consumption, but production. We do not, in everyday and efficient language, recognize language and syntax as the connective and normalizing systems they are. By removing connectives, we are forced to relive order in its ordering. Perhaps not surprisingly, Pound will associate the passivity of imagery, the lack of vitality in thinking, with the loss of a fertile ground of artistic production outside the system of capital. By contrast, we can think of the ways Deleuze and Guattari do not want to break with capitalism's tendency to take the movements of bodies into inorganic flows and systems, but want to release that movement from capital. Their immanent and passive vitalism would not be a return to a force before capitalism in syntax, but a move within capital and relations, not a grounding of syntax, relation, and systems on some anterior life force or spirit above and beyond systems, but an intuition of the powers of relation and proliferation within, between, and among bodies. Pound's reference back to a force that would not be submitted to the system of circulation, the references in the health section of Cantos to Renaissance patronage of excess and to spending without calculation of return, reveals a sexually normative image of life at the heart of active vitalism. Opposed to the fruitful and expansive relation between productive force and a production that can be released into the open, Pound's banker, Jew, journalist, homosexual, necrophiliac closes production in upon himself as redundant language, dead money, or non-actualizing flows of putrid bodily fluids. Skin flakes, repetitions, erosions, endless rain from the arse hairs. As the earth moves, the center passes over all parts in succession, a continual bum belch distributing its productions. Desire is caught up in itself, bearing no distance from itself. Pound's aesthetics valorize the distances between terms and sounds without an overarching unity or reason. The productive excess of terms without subordination to a recognizable, consumable, or syntactical sense demands that the reader work in relation to the poem. Rather than follow some natural order of sense, he has to reawaken the creation of order before the efficient, reified, systematized, and jejune order of commodity production. Pound's form of vitalism is anti-capitalist in its opposition to a world reduced to so much already formed circulating content. Art should always be other than the ready-made. This entails either taking the ready-made and presenting it as already formed through quotation and repetition out of context and order, or cutting into the ready-made with radically external, alien, and unreadable matters. As the cantos proceeds, the typeface takes over the voice, with the intrusion of dollar signs, Chinese characters, ancient Greek, diacritical marks, numerical calculations. The poet is not one whose voice extends itself into speech and content, but can only be assumed, after the event, as that which would be other than any of the presented fragments. We can contrast Pound's active vitalism with Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the art of the ready-made, which has two features. First, art is inhuman. In What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari describe a bird selection of materials for its territory as the beginning of art in the form of the ready-made. This is not a process of defamiliarization or decontextualization, but a selection of a matter that has a quality or thisness that allows a body to form a territory, to create relations, and to produce a body-world coupling. Second, the ready-made does not refer back to the gesture or selection of an absent artist, for there is no self who selects. From selection and relations, or the encounter of forces, something like a body or milieu is formed. This is art as the house or dwelling, a certain detachment or standing alone of matters.